Welcome to Breaking Down Mental Health with Dr. Jones. In these educational videos, Dr. Jones will discuss mental health diagnosis, clinical supervision, using technology in counseling, multiculturalism, and many other topics to help you get a healthy understanding of why mental health is important. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button if you enjoy these videos. I want to welcome you to this video about I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. I just want to remind you that this is a book that is written by Austin Channing Brown. So it's extremely important that you purchase and read this book prior to looking at this video because the things we'll talk about in this video will correlate very well with the book. And so if you have not read the book, then you will not have context for what I'm talking about here. So I want to make sure I want to emphasize in each one of these videos in this series that's important for you that you have read the chapter before coming and listen to workplace views that I have about these different viewpoints in this chapter. So in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we want to look at some of the thoughts on integration in the workplace. And so in each one of these videos, we're going to look at how do we implement what Austin Channing Brown's vision for her book. What does that look like in the workplace? We want to do that in each one of these videos. And so this video will specifically look at chapter 1 and chapter 2 of her book. In chapter 1 of the book, her first chapter as the book opens is called White People Are Exhausting. For many individuals, as they open the book, and that's the first chapter they see, it can throw them off a little bit just by that title of White People Are Exhausting. But I think it's important for us to realize, as Austin Channing Brown is going throughout this whole book, this is her perspective. This is her life story. So it's important for us to recognize that when people are telling their story, they have some leeway in how they could come across and how they explain the processes they have been through. So it's important for us to realize that although she may not mean this about every single person, but the ones she's speaking about in this book, that's where she's coming from. So that's important for us to respect the perspective the author is coming from this textbook, this book that she's written, and to understand that as she says, white people are exhausting, at least from her experience. And so some bullet points I want to cover, at least for this first chapter, and kind of go a little bit deeper into each one of these and give some expanded thoughts on how this chapter can be used in a workplace if you're using this for your employees to help them to understand this book in a better place. One of the first things that Austin talks about is name bias in the workplace. As you read the book here, you understand that she was named Austin, and one of the main reasons why that was done is that her parents wanted to make sure that she had opportunity to be able to be seen in the workplace and actually get a job in the workplace because of her name. And for many people, as when they read that or they hear that, they're saying that can't be true. You know, people don't get judged on their resumes or their CVs based upon their name. The reality of this has been going on for a long time. That when we think about name bias in the workplace, depending on what your first name sounds like or what your last name sounds like, it gives people an understanding of what their perception of who you are as a person. So if your first name or last name sounds ethnic, then someone may make the assumption that you're from an ethnic minority background, which may or may not be true, but the assumption has already been made. And since that assumption has been made, people react out of their assumptions. And so what Austin was helping us to see in this book is that there was name bias in the workplace, and this is something that continues to happen. And so for her, and as she would reach out for jobs, specific wording in the resume and also in her CV had to happen in the workplace. And so one of the questions I always wonder is that when we have individuals, when we're looking to hire individuals in our organizations, how much attention do we pay to their first and last names? Are we being biased by our assumptions we have about their particular background? If their last name may have more of a Hispanic last name, are we paying attention to that? Or is that something we're considering? If their name is more African American, if their name is more Asian, are we making assumptions about that person just because of what their name is. And so the research out there is telling us the answer is yes. So there was a study in 2003 where they went and actually sent in resumes to different organizations, the exact same resumes with the exact same information on there. The only thing that was different was the name that was on there. And they would notice that people will have a lot less likely to get called in for an interview just because of their name was on there, even though the experience was the exact same on the resume. And so this study was replicated and done again in 2021. And you would imagine in 18 years that things would have changed in that time period, but nothing really has changed that much. That we're still seeing there is bias in the workplace, name bias in the workplace. And because of that, minority populations are not able to get into roles and positions they're wanting to get into because of their name, or maybe because they've married into a family with a ethnic name, and so because of that, that's keeping them from being able to get into the jobs or roles they want to get into. So it's important for us to realize and to look at what are our hiring practices we're having in the workplace. Are we harming our the diversity of our organizations that we are part of because we are not taking the time to not only look at the qualifications of the person, but also look at the names there and not come there with some type of preconceived bias. But the reality is, name bias in the workplace is something that still continues to go on right now. Something else I also touched on in this book was talking about what is considered professional when an individual is black. And I think this can be something that can be looked at from many different perspectives, even from other cultural perspectives. I want you to think right now, for example, whatever your racial background is or whatever culture you come from, and ask yourself this question. Has a law ever had to be passed to help you to be able to wear your hair in a certain manner in your workplace? Think about that for a second. Has a law ever had to be passed at a state or even federal level for you to be able to wear your hair in a certain way in the workplace? Now, many of you who are listening to this probably thinking that doesn't happen. That's not something that's ever happened. But the reality of it is that when someone is specifically from a black population or African American population or culture, that hair is something that is regulated. The way in which hair is worn has regulations behind it. We've seen it in sporting events where young athletes, especially African American athletes, there's a YouTube video of them having to cut their hair before they are running in races or participating in any type of sports because their hair is not considered professional. But once again, when we look at the rules and things that are written, the rules and things that are written aren't written by those who are from minority populations. It's written by people who are from the majority population. And so their hair is being regulated. And so that becomes a problem when someone is not able to show up to the workplace authentically as themselves. That, can I wear my hair naturally the way that it is, or do I have to change my hairstyle in order to make an individual to feel comfortable? So hairstyle is something that is regulated amongst African American people or black people. We see there's other populations as well. And so the question is, what does your policy say about what does it look like to be professional? Are there policies in there when it comes to hair? And if there are policies in your workplace about hair, what is the purpose behind them? I think when we have an opportunity to sit down and think about that will help us understand the why behind the reason we're doing things. May change things a little bit, quite a bit. So why do we have certain regulations on hair? Why does hair have to be a certain length? Why does hair have to be a certain color, for example? Why are things such as cornrows or braids or things of that nature not considered to be professional? But when other individuals wear those hairstyles and they do it for fun, there's no problem with that. But when that's someone's natural, that's the way they naturally wear their hair because that's what's most comfortable for them, there's regulations put on that. I think that's something that we should think about. Also, when we consider speech, How do we speak in such a way in which it's considered professional? Once again, we need to go back and look at who wrote the guidelines on what is professional speech in the workplace. Is it okay for your employees to be able to use slang in the workplace or use language that is more comfortable for them? Are we forcing everyone to speak a certain language in the workplace? Are we forcing people to speak in a certain manner in the language, a certain manner? And if we are, the question then becomes why? Once again, let's look behind that. Who made those rules? What was the purpose behind those rules? And what deemed certain ways of speech as being professional and other ways of speech being unprofessional? And what you end up having here is that you end up having individuals coming into a workplace where they're having to code switch, where they're having to speak one way at home, one way outside the workplace, and come into workplace and be a different person and speak differently. And when we see that happening over and over again, that person is basically giving up part of themselves in order to conform to the workplace. But that seems a bit unfair when that's not something that's being asked of everyone, but only to minoritized populations. And so that's something we need to consider is the why behind those rules when it comes to speech. Another thing is what is considered professional dress. When we're looking at individuals and what they wear, if they wear clothes that's more representative of their culture, why is that something that is not considered to be professional? And once again, we go back to those rules again. Who wrote those rules and who is the person that makes up those rules for the workplace? And how much training do they have when it comes to cultural dress? And so it's important for us to make sure as we go and we look at our policies and our procedures for the workplace to make sure that some of the things that we're asking of our employees to do, we're really asking them to leave their real selves at home and to bring a portion of themselves into the workplace. And so if I'm only able to bring a portion of myself into the workplace, then I'm really not going to be able to fully give myself to that job in the way that I want to do. And so let's make sure we start going through our policies and procedures that we have. Let's make sure we're going through those and seeing why are certain rules made the way they are. And so if you're in management, this is something for you to consider. If you're not in management, I will encourage you to ask those questions on why some of these rules have been set in place. Another thing we see in this book was what was called the Black expert syndrome. And what we consider by this, and you can use Black expert syndrome here, you can use any cultural population for that. But what happens a lot of times in organizations is that whenever there's an individual who is from a minority population, when a question comes up about that minority population, they make that individual become the expert for that entire population. And the problem with that is you're putting pressure on someone to be the spokesperson for an entire population versus an individual actually getting the education they need about that population. So, for example, there have been times where I've been the only person of color working in my organization, and they want to learn more about how do we work more with Black clients. Well, I had to become an expert for them. And the question then became is that really fair to that person to have to educate you on who they are? Or is it better for you to get some reason to do your own research and to come up with and to know how to do that? Because one of the problems of being an expert on your own population is that it's not possible. We have to realize that whatever culture people come from, no culture is a monolith. There's a lot of variations of every population that we come across and every culture that we come across. So it's important for us to realize that we must take some time to be able to allow those individuals to be able to say, no, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to be your expert on this population. Bring someone from the outside who doesn't mind doing that, because once that person becomes the expert, they never really get a break from that. And then they're called upon all the time to have to be the expert on these situations. And they may say some things that may make the management or make the other employees there uncomfortable. And now they have to work in an environment that's been made uncomfortable because they've been asked to do so. So I think in situations like this, it's important for us to make sure that we are bringing people in from the outside to become experts per se when it comes to different populations, and not putting individuals in your company on a pedestal to do those type of things, because that can cause more damage than good in the end. And so once again, that does not necessarily have to be a black expert, but once again, any type of minority group that is in your population at work, be careful about making them the experts, because once again, you're putting extra pressure on them that they may have not asked for. Another thing she talks about in chapter 1, it talks about the responsibility of compassion. And this was a chapter that really resonated with me quite a bit. And what happens, there are certain situations where you may have people of color or minorities in your population, or those who are not a part of majority population. They may get offended by what someone has said to them in the workplace. And now there is pressure upon them to report these things. So not only do they have to listen to things that aren't comfortable to them, now they have to go and report something that's not comfortable to them. And then once they report these things, there is sometimes a lack of compassion towards them, because they're put into a position where they need to, for lack of a better term, suck those things up, suck those feelings up, and give the benefit of the doubt to the person who has offended them. And so the responsibility of compassion falls on the person of color. And that can become very dangerous, because now, as a person of color or as a person who's a minority, I'm having to not only be offended, but now I also have to give grace to the person who did that, versus my management or someone else actually calling the person out about the things that they said. So I think we have to be very careful about whenever someone does come to management, or someone comes to us as a coworker and they say, hey, something is said has offended me. Let's not be so quick to jump and say, well, they didn't mean anything by that. How do we know? We don't know if they mean anything about it unless we actually ask that person the question. But once again, don't put the person who's a minority or the person who's being offended in a position where they're responsible for showing compassion to the other person, and that individual really basically does not have to deal with anything at all. So that responsibility of compassion is a big thing. Another thing that was talked about in this first chapter that I've seen a lot in workplaces is individuals being seen but not heard, where it's very obvious that they are different because they are from a different culture or a different background. And so everything they do is seen because they do stand out in the workplace. But once again, if that individual has something that's going on with them that they're not comfortable with, they have something in the workplace that is not really fitting well from them, they may go and talk to management. They may go and talk to other people they work with in the workplace, and they are seen in the workplace, but their voice is not heard because they may feel like there's no one they can go and talk to about the things they're feeling. That's why representation is a really important part of any type of corporate or organization, that they will have people they feel like they can go and talk to about the things that they are experiencing. So they feel like they're seen, but they're not heard. But part of that being seen is also not healthy too, because it almost may seem like that if they are doing a good job, they become what we call the model minority, that because of their work they're doing in the workplace, people can now hold them up and say, well, they're doing a good job for a black person, or they're doing a good job for filling in whatever culture you want to do. And that individual shouldn't have to step up to that standard. They should be able to do a good job without there being anything else tagged along on top of that. And so that being seen for what you do, but not being able to have anyone to go to, not being heard, can be harmful. But what can also be just as harmful is making this person a calling them elite in what they do based on the culture they're coming from, versus if that person's just as good at what they're doing, they're an excellent employee regardless of what their culture is. And so we have to be careful about that. And the last thing we saw in chapter 1 was his willingness to celebrate blackness. I always wonder with companies, and I wonder with individuals, how comfortable are we talking? Are we talking about celebrating culture? And it doesn't necessarily, and I know in this book specifically talking about black culture, but why do we get uncomfortable when it comes to celebrating culture that outside of white culture? And some people might think, well, what exactly is white culture? Well, white culture is what we basically celebrate on a daily basis. Those are things that come up on our calendars that we just normally celebrate because that's what's always been put out before us. But when we start looking to other cultures and we start looking to other holidays that other cultures celebrate, or days of the year that are important to other to other individuals, are we okay with celebrating those just as well? For example, many people of color don't look at July the 4th as being the day of independence because many individuals who sign a Declaration of Independence also owned slaves at the exact same time they were writing the Declaration of Independence. So for many individuals who are minorities, July 4th is not a Independence Day because their ancestors did not have independence during those time periods. So for many individuals who are from the African American culture, they look at Juneteenth, June 19th, as being the day of independence because that's when slaves knew that they were free. For example, those who were enslaved were free at the time period. Or other minority populations, when they look at their history, they want to be able to talk about their history and be able to do it in the workplace and be able to do it freely. But if the workplace is set up in such a way where that my days that's important to me aren't celebrated, or the days that are important to me aren't really talked about, then it's hard for an individual to come and be authentic in the workplace. And so I asked the question, how open are our spaces that we work in to be willing to celebrate blackness and be willing to celebrate other cultures? I think we need to we should be thinking about that. And if it's not feeling comfortable for individuals, this is something we should definitely be working towards. And so those are just some of my thoughts I had about chapter 1 of this book about white people are exhausting. In chapter 2, Austin Channing Brown named this Playing Spades. And so what we see here, one of the first things we see in the book here is this dissonance between culture at home and culture in the workplace. And the way I see this, and the way I want to talk about this a little bit, so for many individuals is once again that ideology of having to leave my culture at home and not be able to bring that into the workplace at all. And for example, Austin Channing Brown talked a lot about playing spades and that being something that she didn't understand, and that was really important part of her culture of her culture that she missed out on. And so that was a part of culture that it took a long time for her to be able to capture and to grasp. And so for many individuals, or especially minority populations in the workplace, I wonder sometimes how much space do we allow for there to be less distance between culture at home? That some of the practices that we have at home, are we able to carry those over into the workplace? Or are those things being discouraged? And I think the only way to really find this out is to talk to individuals in your workplace to find out what are some of the big cultural differences they see at home versus some of the cultural differences they see in the workplace, and are they matching up or are they not matching up? Because it's important for us to realize that someone can feel their culture at home and feel at peace at home. But if they step into the workplace and as soon as they come across that threshold, all of that goes away, then that individual finds themselves in a situation where they're not able, once again, to be truly themselves in the workplace. And so, once again, they are not able to share themselves or be seen the way they want to be seen because there's a disconnect between those two places. Also, limited access to Black history. Now, in this book, Austin Channing Brown does not specifically talk about critical race theory. And I do want to spend just a couple minutes talking about that theory, just because I think we have a really bad understanding of what that really is and how that can be played out in the workplace. For many individuals, when they hear critical race theory or hear about that or CRT, one of the things that automatically pops into their mind is this person is going to be teaching something that is anti-black. Sorry, anti-black, excuse me, something that is anti-white. But the reality of it is what critical race theory is really teaching is teaching an unveiled history of America, and part of that touches on black history. And what the problem with that is that people get upset because they don't want to hear how history has affected individuals who are people of color. And it's not necessarily just for African American individuals, it could be for other minority populations in the workplace as well. And for some reason, we get uncomfortable hearing history because sometimes history doesn't sound good. Sometimes history doesn't make us feel good. But if it's history, we should be open to hearing it and listening to it so we can learn how not to make these experiences happen again. So if we have clients who are coming in, especially if we're thinking about from a mental health perspective, who are coming in and they know their history and we're not willing to speak to them about their history, then we're limiting their access. We're telling them your history is not really that important. Or when someone talks about part of their history that they are just learning about, and we're not open to that, or it makes us uncomfortable, we are limiting their access to their history because of our comfort. So it's important for us to learn how to be comfortable with people, with their stories, with their history, even if I wasn't an individual who caused that pain for them. Because sometimes that is just our own guilt that's playing, or we feel guilty about things that are happening. We're feeling bad about some things that are happening. And that's never is the intention. That's not even really the intention behind the critical race theory, is to make people feel bad about anything. Everything behind critical race theory really points to the fact that we need to tell history in a way in which it really occurred. Because for lack of a better term, we have whitewashed history, and we bring out the things that are important that make us feel good, but the things that don't make us feel good, we downplay those things, or we don't talk about those things whatsoever. And that becomes problematic, especially in the workplace, when people want to be able to talk about things that is important to them. And so when maybe a conversation comes up about Black Wall Street, and if you don't know about Black Wall Street, I would definitely tell you to Google that. Or when conversations come up about great inventors in our country, or great things that are happening in different minority populations and cultures in their communities, we never really hear about these things. And so someone might be talking about that. And if we don't give them that space to do that, then we're basically telling them those things are not important. And so that stifles people from telling their stories. So we don't want to limit people's access to their history. Also, she talked about in this book about justified black anger. I want to talk about this just for a couple minutes as well. When we think about anger, a good definition I've heard about anger before is that when we talk about anger, that anger it can be a secondary emotion, but sometimes anger can be a primary emotion. And that can be when someone has threatened you or when someone has violated you. So if someone's threatened me or violated me, it gives me the right to feel anger. And so one thing we are noticing, especially in the mental health world, is that in the workplace, there may be something that's going on in the community, or we may see an African American who has been shot by the police, for example, and we see these images that are coming up on the news feeds. We see somebody from a minority population who's being abused by an authority figure, whatever the case may be. And this happens over and over and over again. And so I've seen this trauma this person has gone through. I'm experiencing some vicarious trauma as a client or even as a clinician, and these things are bothering me. Now I come into work or I come in to see my therapist. I'm going to talk about these things, And we feel justified in being angry about that. And instead of being able to say, let that person feel angry about it, it's very easy to make the point that, well, maybe this is not what it seems, or we don't have all the information yet. And so we stifle people's ability to feel anger. And the problem with that is when we stifle people's ability to express anger, then we're telling them their emotions do not matter, which makes the anger even worse. And so we need to get from this place of stifling anger and realizing that individuals, especially those who are from minority populations, they are justified in the anger that they are experiencing. And since they're justified in that anger, allow them to be able to talk about it. Allow them spaces where they can have these conversations about these things. Because if they don't have the space to talk about this anger they're feeling, then once again, they are not going to feel at home in the place that they're working. And so if I feel comfortable at home talking about these things, but as soon, once again, I walk across the threshold of work and I can't talk about it, then now I don't feel like I'm not really there. So if I'm making my employees feel that way, if I'm making coworkers feel that way, or if I'm making my clients feel that way, then I'm basically telling them your feelings really don't matter. Maybe you're overreacting. And to tell someone they're overreacting, we're taking away their emotions from them. And when we take someone's emotions away from them, this just causes more anger. So I think it's important for us to allow people to be justified in their anger. The book specifically talks about black anger, but I think this is something that goes to many minority populations that they need to be able to feel justification in their anger. Also, victims of assumptions. In the book with Austin Channing Brown talks about this as well. That minority populations can be victims of assumptions, that we see certain things maybe being played out in media, or maybe we see and hear things around the workplace or with the individual we're working with, and we make assumptions about these individuals before we really get a chance to know them. And now we treat people as if they've done something because of our assumptions. Imagine being an individual where people are always thinking the worst about you, even though they don't know you, they don't know your situations or anything like that. How would that feel? How comfortable would you be going to talk to someone about your problems as a therapist? How would you comfortable you feel with your coworkers or with the employer if they're automatically making assumptions about you because of something their preconceived notions? There's a word for that. It's called prejudice. This is where we are prejudging someone before we actually get to know them, or before we get to know the whole story there. So it's important for us to make sure when it comes to our minority populations that we are not assuming things about them, that we find things out about them before we come to a conclusion about things. But so many individuals walk into counseling offices, walk into as employees into these situations where they become victims of assumptions and they have to prove themselves as they're basically guilty until proven innocent, when that's not really the reality of what we should be looking at. And also, to close out this chapter, the second chapter, she talked about faith and spirituality being a part of the Black experience. Once again, the Black experience is not a monolith. For every individual who's Black or minority, or from a minority population, I won't say this hits for everyone, but she was talking a lot about how faith and spirituality becomes a part of that experience. And us being comfortable talking about faith and spirituality. And I realize for many of us who may be listening to this right now, you may not be a person who is a person of faith, or you may not be a person who believes in spirituality or things of that nature. But one thing we must remember, that faith and spirituality is a multicultural issue. We cannot get away from that. That when we look at the United States and a number of individuals who claim some type of faith, they claim some type of spirituality, it's the majority of people in the United States. And this is a cultural issue. It's a multicultural issue. So if we simply say, no, we don't talk about those type of things, what you're saying is nope, I want to ignore a part of this individual's life. I want to ignore their faith. I want to ignore their spirituality because I don't practice that. Well, if that is the ideology we take with all of our clients, then we probably won't be able to work with any clients, because with all the clients that come in, we're going to find something that we don't necessarily agree with or we don't see eye to eye with them on. But that does not mean that we can't still talk to them about those situations, because that's a part of their experience that they're lived. And so when we're trying to hear people's lived experiences, remember that faith and spirituality does come up a lot in minority populations. If this is something that you're not comfortable with, my encouragement would be get some more training and education in this area so that you can be more culturally competent in this area. But faith and spirituality is a big deal in minority populations, and for many individuals, it makes them feel uncomfortable if they're not trained in that area. And so sometimes they just ignore it. But when you're ignoring that, you're ignoring a big part of who individuals are by not including their faith and spirituality. Well, I hope this video has been helpful for you to just get some different perspectives on Austin Channing's Brown book. And this is just kind of an overview of chapter 1 and chapter 2 and just some of my viewpoints on there. And I'm looking forward to joining you in the next video where we're looking at chapter 3 and chapter 4 of I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness.